The oil-stained concrete of Jake "Thunder" Morrison's garage had seen plenty of broken-down machines, but never a broken spirit like the one that crawled through his door that rainy October night. The German Shepherd mix was barely alive, ribs showing, fur matted with blood, eyes that had given up hope. Most people saw Jake as just another leather-wearing, Harley-riding troublemaker. They didn't know he was a decorated army medic who'd lost everything in Afghanistan, including his faith in humanity. As Jake knelt beside the trembling dog, something stirred in his chest. The same protective instinct that once made him risk his life for fallen soldiers. But this wasn't just about saving an animal. 3 blocks away, her sadistic owner was already searching, and Jake's military training told him this man wouldn't stop until he reclaimed his property. What Jake didn't know was that nursing this dog back to health would lead him straight to the love of his life, a veterinarian with secrets of her own. But first, he'd have to survive what was coming for them both. Would Jake's warrior instincts be enough to protect the innocent life that had chosen to trust him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the garage's metal roof like artillery fire, triggering memories Jake fought to suppress. He forced himself to focus on the present, on the dog whose breathing was so shallow he had to lean close to confirm she was still alive. Her dark eyes tracked his movements with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that cut straight through his carefully constructed emotional armor. "Easy, girl," he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken softly to another living being in months. The isolation had become his preferred state since returning stateside 18 months ago, when the nightmares and survivor's guilt had driven away everyone who'd tried to help. Jake's hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from countless battlefield triage situations taking over. He grabbed a clean shop rag and dampened it with bottled water, gently cleaning the worst of the blood from around her muzzle. She flinched but didn't try to bite, a heartbreaking sign of learned helplessness that made his jaw clench. The dog's injuries told a story he recognized from his deployment days. Systematic, repeated, intentional, fresh wounds layered over older scars. Whoever had done this enjoyed causing pain. A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps on wet pavement, accompanied by a harsh voice calling, "Here, Bella! Come on, you stupid mutt!" The dog beside him began to shake violently, a whimper escaping her throat. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the Glock tucked beneath his workbench. His pulse remained steady. Combat had trained that reflex out of him, but every nerve ending went on high alert. Through the gap beneath the garage door, he could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping back and forth across the street. "I know you're out here somewhere," the voice continued, closer now. "When I find you, you're gonna regret running off like that." The dog, Bella, pressed herself closer to Jake's legs, seeking protection she'd probably never received before. Something deep inside his chest, something he'd thought died in the mountains of Afghanistan, began to thaw. He made a decision that would change everything. Standing slowly, Jake killed the overhead lights and guided Bella behind his Harley, where they'd be hidden if anyone peered through the windows. The garage fell silent except for the rain and their combined breathing. Through a grimy window, he watched a heavy-set man in a stained undershirt stumble down the sidewalk, flashlight beam weaving erratically. Drunk. That would make things easier if it came to a confrontation. The man stopped directly in front of Jake's garage, close enough that Jake could smell the alcohol and unwashed body odor even through the closed door. For a long moment he stood there, swaying slightly, before spitting into the street and moving on. "That's right. Keep walking," Jake muttered under his breath. But he knew this wasn't over. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when their pride was wounded. He looked down at the broken creature who'd somehow chosen him and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. In Afghanistan, he'd sworn an oath to do no harm, to preserve life above all else. That oath hadn't expired just because he'd come home. "Looks like it's you and me, girl," he said quietly, already calculating routes and contingencies. Time to see if this old soldier's still got some fight left in him. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and somewhere in the darkness, Bella's tormentor was still searching. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jake's garage floor when he found her still there, curled in the same corner where she'd collapsed the night before. She hadn't moved more than a few inches, her breathing shallow but steady. The water bowl sat untouched, but he noticed she'd managed a few tentative licks at the food. Jake crouched down slowly, his leather boots scraping against the concrete. The dog's eyes snapped open immediately, that same mixture of terror and defiance he'd seen last night. But this time, she didn't try to run. Maybe she was too weak, or maybe something had shifted in those dark hours they'd shared the same space. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. Sleep had been elusive, filled with dreams that blurred the line between the dog's wounds and memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." He'd called in sick to the construction site. First time in 18 months. Ray would understand eventually. The crew knew better than to ask too many questions about Jake's rare moments of what they generously called compassion. They'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns, staying clear when the storms hit. The dog watched him with those intelligent brown eyes as he gathered supplies from his first aid kit. He'd patched up enough road rash and bar fight casualties to know his way around wounds, though this felt different, more delicate. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hands that had delivered their share of punishment now trying to heal. "This is going to hurt," he warned, settling cross-legged on the floor a few feet away. "But you already know about hurt, don't you?" She flinched when he reached toward her, but didn't snap. Her muzzle was grey around the edges, suggesting she wasn't young, which made her survival even more remarkable. The cuts along her ribs were angry and red, some showing signs of infection. Jake's jaw tightened as he took inventory of each injury, each testament to someone's cruelty. The cleaning process was slow, punctuated by her soft whimpers and his whispered reassurances. Strange how easily the gentle words came when he'd forgotten he still knew them. His fingers, usually steady only when gripping handlebars or throwing punches, moved with surprising tenderness across her matted fur. "There," he said finally, sitting back on his heels, "that's the worst of it." The dog's tail gave the faintest twitch, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement. Progress. Jake's phone buzzed against his leg. Sarah's name lit up the screen, and his chest tightened reflexively. 3 years, and a contact photo still had the power to stop his breath. He let it go to voicemail, but the damage was done. The careful walls he'd built around this morning cracked slightly. The dog seemed to sense the shift in his mood. She lifted her head, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, like she could see past the leather and scars to the raw places he kept hidden. "What?" he asked, more defensive than the situation warranted. "You think you've got me figured out?" Her response was to close her eyes and rest her chin on her paws, but she kept one ear tilted in his direction, listening, waiting. The simple gesture of trust hit him harder than he expected. Jake stood abruptly, needing distance. He busied himself organizing tools that didn't need organizing, adjusting parts that were already perfectly aligned. The garage had become his sanctuary after everything fell apart, a place where problems had solutions, where broken things could be fixed with the right parts and enough determination. But some things couldn't be repaired with wrenches and welding torches. The dog stirred behind him, and he turned to see her attempting to stand. Her legs shook the effort, but she managed to stay upright long enough to take a few tentative steps toward the water bowl. This time, she drank deeply, her pink tongue working steadily. "Smart girl," Jake murmured, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. When she finished drinking, she looked at him again, and something passed between them in that look. Recognition, maybe, or just the understanding that they were both damaged things trying to figure out how to keep going. Jake's phone buzzed with a text this time. Sarah again. He deleted it without reading, but the dog had seen his reaction. She limped over to where he stood and, with obvious effort, settled herself beside his boots. not touching but close enough that he could feel her warmth. For the first time in 3 years, Jake didn't feel completely alone in his carefully constructed isolation. The irony was sharp. It had taken a broken dog to remind him what companionship felt like. Outside, his Harley sat waiting in the driveway, freedom and escape just a key turn away. But Jake found himself settling back down on the garage floor instead, close enough to the dog that she could feel protected, far enough away that neither of them felt trapped. They had nowhere else to be. The morning sun filtered through the grimy garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where Jake knelt beside the makeshift bed he'd constructed from old shop rags and a torn sleeping bag. The dog hadn't moved much during the night, her breathing shallow but steady. He'd checked on her 3 times, unable to sleep himself, haunted by the sight of her injuries and the trust she'd somehow placed in him. Jake had seen plenty of damage in his 34 years, twisted metal from crashes, scars from bar fights, hearts shattered beyond repair. But something about the deliberate cruelty inflicted on this animal cut deeper than anything he'd experienced since Sarah's funeral. The dog's injuries told a story he recognized too well: systematic abuse, designed to break spirit as much as bone. His phone buzzed against his workbench. Tommy's name flashed on the screen, followed by 3 other missed calls from his riding brothers. Jake ignored them all. The Reapers would want to know why he'd missed last night's run to Murphy's bar, why he hadn't answered his phone. He couldn't explain that he'd spent the night researching dog care on the internet and making trips to his apartment for supplies. The dog managed to finish half the bowl before exhaustion claimed her again. Jake settled into his desk chair, studying her damaged form. Her right front leg was definitely broken, probably from being kicked or struck with something heavy. The cuts along her ribs were precise, methodical, knife work. The thought made his hands clench into fists. Jake pulled up the phone number he'd found online for Dr. Emily Chen's veterinary clinic. The website said she specialized in trauma cases and rescue animals. Perfect, except for one problem. Vets asked questions, and questions led to complications. If this dog belonged to someone, if there were legal issues, Jake had enough trouble without adding theft charges to his rap sheet. But looking at her labored breathing, at the way she unconsciously curled into herself even while sleeping, he knew he didn't have a choice. She needed real medical attention, not his amateur first aid. The clinic's receptionist was efficient and surprisingly unconcerned about his vague explanation of finding an injured stray. They could see him at 2 o'clock if he could transport the animal safely. Jake glanced at his Harley, then at the dog, who probably weighed 60 pounds soaking wet. That was going to require some creative problem-solving. An hour later, he was loading his neighbor's borrowed pickup truck with blankets and trying to figure out how to move an injured animal without causing more damage. The dog watched his preparations with intelligent eyes, as if she understood that something was about to change. "I'm trying to help you," Jake said, approaching slowly with a large blanket. "But this might hurt a little." To his amazement, she didn't fight him. When he carefully slid his arms beneath her, she went limp with trust that nearly broke his heart. Her body was lighter than expected, all ribs and sharp angles where there should have been muscle. She made one small sound of pain as he lifted her, then pressed her face against his chest as if seeking comfort. The gesture hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time any living thing had sought comfort from him? When had he last offered it? Sarah used to curl against him exactly like this when storms kept her awake, her face buried in his shirt while he held her until the thunder passed. He settled the dog gently in the truck's passenger seat, the blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon. She looked impossibly small and fragile against the worn upholstery, but her eyes stayed fixed on his face with unwavering attention. "What am I supposed to call you?" Jake asked, starting the engine. "Can't keep saying, 'Hey, dog,' forever." She tilted her head at the sound of his voice, and something about the gesture reminded him of courage in the face of impossible odds, like a warrior who refused to surrender despite overwhelming defeat. "Rebel," he said suddenly. "That work for you?" As they pulled out of the garage and into the afternoon sunlight, Jake caught himself doing something he hadn't done in 2 years, making plans that extended beyond the next bottle of whiskey. Rebel was going to need time to heal, proper food, maybe training to help her trust again. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jake Reeves had something to live for. The morning sun filtered through the grimy garage windows as Jake crouched beside the dog, watching her shallow breathing. She'd made it through the night, which was more than he'd expected when he'd first seen her broken form. The antibiotics were doing their work, but her body still trembled with each breath. "Easy, girl," he murmured, refilling her water bowl. She lifted her head slightly at his voice, dark eyes tracking his movement. Yesterday, even that small acknowledgement would have seemed impossible. Jake had called in sick to the construction site, the first time in 3 years. Danny, his foreman, hadn't questioned it, probably figuring Jake was nursing another hangover. Let him think that. It was easier than explaining he was playing nursemaid to a dying dog. The sound of boots on gravel made Jake tense. Through the window, he spotted Marcus wheeling his Harley into the driveway. Jake cursed under his breath. Marcus had a key to the garage and a habit of dropping by unannounced. "Jake, you in there?" Marcus's voice boomed as the side door rattled. "Yeah, hold on." Jake positioned himself between the dog and the door as Marcus entered, leather jacket creaking with each step. "Found her yesterday. She's hurt." Marcus approached slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. "Jesus, Jake, look at her. She's half dead." "She's getting better." "Better?" Marcus knelt down, taking in the extent of her injuries. "This dog's been tortured. You need to call animal control." "No." The word came out sharper than Jake intended. "What do you mean, no? She needs a vet, proper medical care, and whoever did this needs to be reported." Jake's jaw tightened. "I said no." Marcus stood, studying his friend's face. They'd known each other since high school, had served 2 tours together in Afghanistan. Marcus could read Jake's moods better than anyone, and right now he was seeing something that worried him. "This isn't about the dog, is it?" Jake turned away, busying himself with checking the dog's bandages. Her tail gave the faintest wag as his fingers gently examined the wounds. The gesture, small as it was, sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "She trusts me," Jake said quietly. "Jake, man, I get it. But this is bigger than—" "She came to me." Jake's voice carried an edge that made Marcus take a step back. "She could have gone anywhere, but she chose here. That has to mean something." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching his friend's careful ministrations. When Jake had returned from their second deployment, something fundamental had broken inside him. The drinking, the isolation, the way he'd pushed away everyone who cared about him, Marcus had watched it all with growing helplessness. "All right," Marcus said finally, "but if she takes a turn for the worse, we're getting her real help." "Deal?" Jake nodded, relief flooding through him. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed Marcus's support until he'd gotten it. "What are you calling her?" The question caught Jake off guard. He'd been so focused on keeping her alive, he hadn't thought about a name. Looking down at her now, something occurred to him. "Scout," he said. "Her name's Scout." As if responding to the name, Scout lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her tail attempted another weak wag, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of something that had been wound tight for too long. Marcus noticed the change immediately. It was subtle, but Jake's shoulders had relaxed, and there was something different in his eyes, something that had been missing for a long time. "Scout it is." Marcus pulled up a crate and sat down. "So what's the plan?" For the first time in months, Jake found himself thinking beyond the next bottle, beyond getting through another sleepless night. Scout needed consistency, patience, gentle care. She needed someone who wouldn't give up on her, even when progress seemed impossible. "Day by day," Jake said. "Build her strength back up. Let her heal. Think she'll make it." Jake watched Scout's steady breathing, the way she'd positioned herself so she could keep him in sight even while resting. Yesterday, she'd been a broken, terrified creature. Today she had a name and the beginning of hope in her eyes. "Yeah," he said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "I think she will." Maybe, for the first time in years, Jake needed to be needed. The morning sun filtered through the grimy garage windows as Jake crouched beside the makeshift bed he'd created for the dog. 3 days had passed since she'd first limped into his life, and the change in her was subtle but unmistakable. The trembling had lessened, though she still flinched whenever he moved too quickly. Her eyes, once vacant with trauma, now tracked his movements with cautious interest. "Hey there, girl," he murmured, extending his hand palm up. She sniffed tentatively, her wet nose barely brushing his fingertips before retreating. Progress, he told himself. Yesterday she wouldn't even lift her head when he approached. The bell above the garage door chimed, and Jake tensed. The dog immediately pressed herself against the far wall, making herself as small as possible. Marcus stepped through the doorway, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete floor. "Still here, I see," Marcus said, nodding toward the dog. He kept his voice low, something Jake appreciated more than he'd admit. "She's not ready to go anywhere yet." Jake stood slowly, brushing dust from his jeans. "Doc Phillips says another week, maybe 2. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Doc Phillips? You took her to the vet?" "Yesterday evening. Had to wrap her in a blanket and carry her to the truck. She was terrified, but—" Jake paused, remembering how she'd pressed against him during the examination, seeking comfort despite her fear. "She let me hold her while he worked. What's the verdict?" "Broken ribs, healing crooked, old fractures in her front leg, malnutrition, cigarette burns." Jake's jaw tightened. "Someone used her as a punching bag for months, maybe longer." Marcus whistled low. "You gonna report it?" "To who?" Dog could have come from anywhere within a 100-mile radius. Besides, Jake glanced back at the huddled form. She's safe now. That's what matters. Around noon, the garage door opened again. This time, it was Tommy Reeves, a regular customer whose wife had been after him to fix their lawnmower for weeks. Tommy was loud, gesticulating wildly as he complained about the mower's refusal to start, his voice bouncing off the walls like gunshots. The dog's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She scrambled back to her corner, whimpering softly, her whole body shaking. Jake felt something twist in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years. "Tommy," Jake interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the man's rambling. "Keep it down." Tommy looked confused. "What's got into you, Jake? I said, keep it down." Jake's tone brooked no argument. He jerked his head toward the corner where the dog cowered. "You're scaring her." Understanding dawned on Tommy's face. He glanced at the dog, then back at Jake, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sorry, man. Didn't know you had a... Is she okay?" "She will be." Jake surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. He wasn't sure when he'd decided that, but somewhere between her first tentative tail wag and the way she'd sought his comfort at the vet's office, it had become fact. That evening, after Tommy had left with his repaired mower and Marcus had headed home to his family, Jake found himself alone with the dog again. He'd picked up some high-quality food from the pet store, ignoring the curious looks from other customers who clearly weren't used to seeing leather-clad bikers in the dog food aisle. He sat cross-legged on the floor a few feet from her bed, a bowl of food in his hands. "I know you're hungry," he said softly, "but you're gonna have to come get it." For 20 minutes, they stayed locked in this gentle standoff. The dog's nose twitched at the smell of the food, her stomach audibly rumbling, but fear kept her pressed against the wall. Jake didn't move, didn't push, just waited with the patience of a man who understood that trust couldn't be rushed. Finally, she took a tentative step forward, then another. Her eyes never left his face as she crept toward the bowl, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. When she was close enough, Jake slowly placed the bowl on the ground and slid it toward her. She ate hungrily but carefully, glancing up at him between bites. When she finished, she didn't immediately retreat. Instead, she sat there, studying him with those intelligent brown eyes. "That's it, girl," Jake whispered. We're gonna figure this out together." As if she understood, her tail gave the faintest wag. The veterinary clinic smelled like antiseptic and fear. Colt sat in the waiting room, the small dog trembling in his lap, despite the blanket he'd wrapped around her. Every few minutes she'd lift her head to look at him with those dark eyes, as if checking to make sure he hadn't abandoned her. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, his calloused fingers gentle against her matted fur. "We're gonna get you fixed up." When Dr. Sarah Chen called them back, Colt felt his jaw clench at the way the dog pressed herself against his chest. Trust didn't come easy to either of them, but somehow this broken little creature had decided he was safe. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with," Dr. Chen said, her voice soft and professional. She was younger than Colt had expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. As she began her examination, the dog whimpered, but didn't try to bite or flee. The silence stretched as Dr. Chen worked, her expression growing darker with each discovery. Colt found himself holding his breath, watching the careful way she handled each injury, each sign of abuse. 3 broken ribs, all healed wrong, she finally said, not looking up from her work. Malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds on her back legs, and this scar across her muzzle. She paused, her jaw tight. Someone used a wire muzzle on her, probably for extended periods. Colt's hands clenched into fists. What kind of sick bastard? The kind that should never be allowed near an animal again. Dr. Chen's voice carried an edge of steel beneath its professional calm, but the good news is she's a fighter. With proper care, she can recover from most of this, most of it. The ribs will always cause her some discomfort, especially in cold weather, and she'll likely always be skittish around strangers, but physically she can heal. Dr. Chen finally looked up at him. The question is, are you prepared for what that means? She's going to need months of medication, special food, gentle exercise to build her strength back up, and patience, lots of patience. Colt looked down at the dog, who had somehow managed to fall asleep against his chest, despite everything. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked peaceful. What do I need to do? 2 hours later, Colt walked out of the clinic with an armload of medications, special food, and instructions that looked like a small novel. The dog, now sporting a bright blue bandage around her injured leg, rode in a proper carrier he'd purchased from the clinic. Back at the garage, he set up a makeshift recovery area in the corner of his apartment above the shop. Soft blankets, food and water bowls, and a space heater to keep her warm. She watched his every movement with those intelligent eyes, as if memorizing the layout of this new safe haven. "Hungry?" he asked, opening a can of the prescription food Dr. Chen had recommended. The smell wasn't appetizing, but the dog's nose twitched with interest. She ate slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to look around as if expecting someone to snatch the food away. It broke something inside Colt's chest to watch her, this careful, fearful way of existing that he recognized all too well. When she was finished eating, she limped over to where he sat on the couch and, after a moment's hesitation, rested her chin on his knee. "Yeah, I know," he said quietly, his hands settling on her head. "It's hard to believe good things can last, isn't it?" His phone buzzed with a text from Raven. "How'd it go at the vet?" Colt stared at the message for a long moment. When was the last time someone had checked on him like this? Not just the casual brotherhood of the club, but genuine concern for something that mattered to him. "She'll be okay. Gonna take time." The response came quickly, for that's what healing takes. Time and someone who gives a damn. He read the message twice, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the dog pressed closer to his leg. "Storm coming," he told her, settling back into the couch. "But we're safe in here." As if she understood, the dog climbed carefully onto the couch beside him, curling up against his thigh with a soft sigh. For the first time in years, Colt didn't mind the idea of being needed by something fragile, maybe even him. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Jake's weathered face as he sat rigid in the plastic chair, his calloused hands gripping his knees. The antiseptic smell reminded him too much of hospitals, of watching his father waste away while machines beeped their mechanical sympathy. He'd sworn he'd never sit in another waiting room, never again endure the suffocating weight of hoping for good news while preparing for the worst. "Mr. Morrison?" Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the examination room, her scrubs bearing small paw prints that somehow made her seem more approachable. "Would you like to come back and see her?" Jake's throat felt like sandpaper. "Is she—" The examination room was smaller than he'd expected, dominated by a steel table where the dog lay on a thick blanket. She looked impossibly fragile under the bright lights, her golden fur matted and dull, ribs visible through her thin coat. But her eyes were open, tracking his movement as he approached. "Hey there, girl," Jake whispered, his voice rougher than intended. He wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but his hands felt too big, too clumsy for something so delicate. Dr. Chen pulled up a chair beside him, clipboard in hand. "I need to be honest with you about what we're dealing with. She's severely malnourished, probably hasn't had regular meals in weeks, maybe months, multiple old fractures in her ribs that healed incorrectly, cigarette burns on her back legs." Her voice remained clinical, but Jake caught the slight tremor of anger beneath the professional facade. Each word hit him like a physical blow. Jake had seen plenty of cruelty in his 42 years, in the joint, on the streets, in his own childhood home, but something about this deliberate torture of something so innocent made his vision blur with rage. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "She's been bred repeatedly, probably starting too young. Her last litter couldn't have been more than a few months ago based on the condition of her mammary glands. Where are her puppies?" The question escaped before Jake could stop it. "Gone. Sold, most likely. Puppy mills don't keep mothers and offspring together." Dr. Chen's pen tapped against her clipboard. The psychological trauma might be even worse than the physical. "She's terrified of sudden movements, loud noises. She flinched when I tried to examine her ears." Jake stared at the dog, watching her shallow breathing, the way her eyes darted between him and the door, as if calculating escape routes. He recognized that hypervigilance, that bone-deep wariness that came from never knowing when the next blow would fall. "What happens now?" he asked. "Physically, she'll recover with proper care, good food, regular meals, medications for the parasites. The emotional healing?" Dr. Chen shrugged. "That depends on a lot of factors. Patience, consistency, time." "How much time?" "Could be months, could be years. Some dogs never fully trust again." She studied Jake's face carefully. "I have to ask, are you prepared for that kind of commitment? She's not going to be a normal pet anytime soon. She might never be." Jake's mind raced through practical concerns he'd never considered. His garage wasn't exactly dog-friendly. He worked 12-hour days at the shop. He'd never owned a pet, never been responsible for anything more fragile than a motorcycle engine. The smart thing would be to let the clinic find her a proper home, someone with experience and patience, and a yard with a white picket fence. But when he looked at her, really looked, he saw something that made his chest tight. The way she held herself, withdrawn but alert. The careful way she breathed, as if even that simple act might provoke punishment. The absence of hope in her eyes that somehow reminded him of his own reflection. "What's involved in the recovery?" he heard himself asking. Dr. Chen outlined a treatment plan that sounded expensive and complicated. Medications, special diet, follow-up appointments, possible surgery for the improperly healed ribs. Jake found himself nodding along, mentally calculating costs against his savings, rearranging his schedule around vet visits he'd never planned to make. "I'll need to keep her overnight for observation," Dr. Chen concluded. "The IV fluids alone will help tremendously. You can pick her up tomorrow afternoon if everything goes well." Jake stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Does she have a name?" "Not that we know of. You'll get to choose." As he walked toward the parking lot, Jake tried to remember the last time he'd named anything. His bikes had always just been the Harley or the Sportster. He'd never seen the point in getting attached to things that could be taken away. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something he couldn't quite define, something that scared him almost as much as the thought of walking away. The morning sun filtered through the garage windows as Jake watched the golden retriever carefully navigate around his motorcycle. 3 weeks had passed since she'd first collapsed in his doorway, and the transformation was remarkable. Her ribs no longer showed through matted fur, and the infected wounds had healed to pink scars hidden beneath her growing coat. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They held a spark now, a cautious hope that hadn't been there before. "Easy, girl," he murmured as she approached his workbench, tail wagging tentatively. He'd been calling her girl for lack of anything better, though he suspected she deserved a real name, something strong, something that honored what she'd survived. The rumble of motorcycles outside made her freeze, ears pinned back. Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized the sound of multiple bikes, his old crew. He hadn't seen them since the accident, since Sarah's funeral, since everything fell apart. His hands stilled on the wrench he'd been holding. "Jake, you in there, brother?" Tommy's voice boomed from outside, followed by the sound of boots on gravel. The dog retreated behind the workbench, trembling. Jake's heart clenched as he watched her cower, reminded of how far she'd come and how easily fear could still consume her. He understood that feeling intimately. "Yeah, I'm here," he called back, moving slowly toward the door. "Stay," he whispered to the dog. Though he wasn't sure if the command was for her protection or his own need to know she'd be there when he returned. Outside, 4 members of the Iron Wolves stood beside their bikes, leather jackets gleaming in the sunlight. Tommy, their president, stepped forward with his characteristic swagger, but Jake caught the concern flickering behind his tough exterior. "Been trying to reach you for months, man. You've gone ghost." "Needed space," Jake replied, crossing his arms. The familiar weight of their judgment pressed against his chest. They blamed him for the accident, just as he blamed himself. Sarah had been riding behind him when the truck ran the red light. If he'd taken a different route, left 5 minutes later, seen the truck sooner. "Look, we get it. Losing Sarah messed you up, but hiding out here like some hermit isn't what she would have wanted." Tommy's voice softened. "The club needs you, Jake. You were our best mechanic, our brother," was being the operative phrase. Jake's voice came out rougher than intended. "I'm done with all that." Marcus, the club's enforcer, spat into the gravel. "Once a wolf, always a wolf. You can't just walk away from family. Watch me." The tension stretched between them like a taut wire. Jake had once found purpose in their brotherhood, in the roar of engines and the open road. But that life belonged to a different man, one who hadn't failed the person he loved most. A soft whine from inside the garage made him turn. Through the window, he could see the dog pacing anxiously, sensing his distress. Something shifted in his chest, a protective instinct he thought had died with Sarah. "You got a dog now?" Razor asked, peering through the window. "Damn thing looks spooked." "She's been through hell," Jake said, surprising himself with a defensive edge in his voice. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you do the pet thing? You said animals were too much responsibility, remember?" Jake remembered. He'd said a lot of things before his world imploded, before he learned that responsibility meant nothing when you couldn't protect what mattered. But watching the dog's slow recovery, seeing her choose to trust again despite everything she'd endured, it was teaching him something he wasn't ready to name. "Things change," he said simply. "Yeah, they do." Tommy studied him with calculating eyes. "Look, there's a run next weekend. Nothing major, just a ride up the coast. Come with us. Bring the dog if you want. Bring whatever helps you remember who you used to be." The invitation hung in the air. Jake felt the familiar pull of the road, the temptation to lose himself in speed and distance. But inside the garage, the dog had stopped pacing and was watching him through the window, those amber eyes holding a trust he was still learning to deserve. "I can't," he said, the words coming easier than expected. "I've got responsibilities here," Marcus snorted. "To a mutt?" "To myself." Jake met each of their gazes steadily. "I'm not the same person I was before. Maybe that's not a bad thing." Tommy nodded slowly, understanding flickering across his weathered features. "If you change your mind, I won't." After they left, Jake returned to the garage, where the dog waited, tail wagging cautiously. She approached him with careful steps, pressing her warm weight against his leg. For the first time in months, he felt like he'd made the right choice. "What do you think, girl? Ready to figure out what comes next?" Her tail wagged harder, and Jake smiled, really smiled, for the first time since Sarah's death. The morning sun streamed through the garage windows as Jake adjusted the carburetor on a Harley Sportster, his calloused fingers working with practiced precision. 3 weeks had passed since he'd taken Luna to Dr. Martinez, and the change in her was remarkable. She lay on her favorite blanket near his workbench, no longer flinching at every sound, her coat beginning to show hints of its natural golden luster. "Looking good, girl," he murmured, glancing down at her. Luna's tail gave a tentative wag, and something warm unfurled in Jake's chest. Trust was a fragile thing, he'd learned, but watching it bloom between them felt like witnessing a small miracle. The rumble of motorcycles approaching made Luna's ears perk up, but she didn't retreat to her hiding spot behind the tool cabinet. Progress. Jake wiped his hands on a rag as Bear, Diesel, and Tommy rolled into the driveway, their bikes gleaming in the sunlight. "Well, I'll be damned," Bear said, pulling off his helmet and eyeing Luna with surprise. "She's still here. Where else would she be?" Jake's tone carried a slight edge of defensiveness that didn't go unnoticed. Tommy dismounted his bike with a grin. "Man's got himself a dog. Never thought I'd see the day Jake Mitchell would go soft." "Shut it, Tommy." But there was no real heat in Jake's words. He crouched down beside Luna, running his hand along her back. She leaned into his touch, and his friends fell silent at the sight. Diesel, usually the most gruff of the group, surprised them all by kneeling down and extending his hands slowly toward Luna. "Hey there, sweetheart. You're looking a hell of a lot better than when we first found you." Luna sniffed his fingers cautiously before allowing him to scratch behind her ears. The simple gesture seemed to break something loose in the group's dynamic, a collective exhale of acceptance. "So, what's the plan?" Bear asked, settling onto an overturned crate. "You keeping her permanent-like?" Jake hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. Each day with Luna had been about survival, hers and, if he was honest, his own. "Haven't decided yet." "Bullshit," Tommy said with a laugh. "Look at you two. You've already decided, you just won't admit it." Before Jake could respond, the sound of a car pulling up made them all turn. A pristine white sedan came to a stop, and Jake's stomach clenched as he recognized Dr. Martinez stepping out, followed by a woman he didn't know. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Martinez called out, approaching with her companion. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I wanted to check on Luna's progress, and I brought someone I'd like you to meet." The woman beside her was younger, probably mid-30s, with kind eyes and an easy smile. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "This is Sarah Chen," Dr. Martinez continued. "She runs a local animal rehabilitation center, and she's been following Luna's case." Sarah stepped forward, her gaze moving between Jake and Luna with obvious interest. "I've heard remarkable things about Luna's recovery. Dr. Martinez tells me you've been taking excellent care of her." Jake felt suddenly self-conscious under her scrutiny, aware of his grease-stained clothes and the rough company surrounding him. Just doing what needed doing. "That's more than most people would do," Sarah said, crouching down to Luna's level. The dog approached her with curiosity rather than fear, allowing Sarah to examine her gently. "She's transformed. The trust she shows, the way she responds to you, it's extraordinary." "She's a fighter," Jake said simply. Sarah looked up at him, and he saw something in her expression that made him uncomfortable, understanding, perhaps even recognition. "So are you, from what I can tell." Dr. Martinez checked Luna's healing wounds while Sarah engaged Jake in conversation about the dog's routine, her eating habits, her behavioral improvements. Jake found himself answering her questions more thoroughly than he'd intended, surprised by her genuine interest and lack of judgment about his lifestyle or appearance. "I run therapeutic programs," Sarah explained, as Dr. Martinez finished her examination, "pairing rescued animals with people who need healing. It's remarkable what they can do for each other." "Luna doesn't need any programs," Jake said quickly. "She's doing fine where she is." "I can see that." Sarah's smile was gentle, not pushing. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise. Sometimes the best therapy happens naturally, between two souls who understand each other's pain." Her words hit closer to home than Jake was comfortable with. He looked down at Luna, who had positioned herself between his legs, leaning against him with complete trust. "The offer stands if you ever want to learn more about what we do," Sarah said, handing him a business card. "But honestly, I think you're already doing exactly what Luna needs." As the two women prepared to leave, Jake felt an unexpected reluctance to see Sarah go. There had been something calming about her presence, a sense of being understood without being judged. The first drops of rain began falling as Marcus loaded the last of his tools into the saddlebags. The garage felt different now, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Sarah stood near the workbench, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of a wrench he'd left behind, while Luna sat perfectly still by the door, as if sensing the weight of the moment. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said quietly, though they both knew the words carried no real conviction. They'd spent the last 3 days planning every detail of their journey to find Marcus's brother, and backing out now felt impossible. Marcus secured the final strap and turned to face her. "Yeah, I do. We've come too far to turn back now." His voice carried a certainty that surprised even him. 3 months ago, the idea of voluntarily confronting his past would have sent him reaching for a bottle. Now, with Luna's steady presence and Sarah's unwavering support, it felt like the only path forward. The thunder rumbled overhead, and Luna's ears flicked nervously. She'd come so far from the trembling, broken creature who'd first stumbled into his garage, but storm still unsettled her. Marcus crouched down and extended his hand, watching as she approached without hesitation. The trust in her dark eyes humbled him every time. "We'll find him," Sarah said, moving closer. "Your brother, I mean." Tommy's message was clear enough. "If Jake's been asking about you in Millfield, he wants to be found." Marcus nodded, though doubt gnawed at his chest. 22 years was a long time. Jake had been barely 16 when Marcus left home, still believing their father's version of events, still trapped in a world Marcus had escaped through anger and rebellion. What if his brother had grown into the same kind of man their father had been? What if this reunion only opened old wounds that had finally begun to heal? "What if he doesn't want to see me?" The words slipped out before Marcus could stop them, revealing a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to witness. Sarah's hand found his shoulder, warm and steady. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But what if he does? What if he's been looking for you all these years, wondering what happened to his big brother?" The rain began falling harder, drumming against the garage roof with increasing intensity. Marcus stood slowly, his hand still resting on Luna's head. The dog had taught him something important about taking chances, about trusting even when trust felt dangerous. She'd chosen his garage out of desperation, but she'd stayed because something deeper had grown between them. Maybe that's what family was supposed to be, not the blood that bound you to people who hurt you, but the choice to keep showing up for those who mattered. "Tommy said Jake's been working at the lumber mill," Marcus said, more to himself than to Sarah. "Same one where our grandfather used to work. Funny how we end up following patterns we swore we'd break." "You're nothing like your father," Sarah said firmly. "I've seen how you are with Luna, how you treat people. That doesn't come from him." The storm intensified, and Sarah glanced toward the windows. "We should probably wait until morning." Riding in this weather won't do any of us any good." Marcus started to agree, then stopped. Waiting felt like giving fear another chance to take root. He'd spent too many years letting fear make his decisions, and each delay only made the weight of unfinished business heavier. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "We leave in an hour. Storm or no storm, I need to do this now." Sarah studied his face, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll get our rain gear ready." As she moved toward their bags, Marcus knelt beside Luna again. The dog pressed against his leg, offering the same silent comfort she'd provided countless times over the past months. He thought about the first night she'd appeared, how her desperate need had somehow answered his own. Now they were both heading into unknown territory, but they weren't going alone. "You ready for an adventure, girl?" he whispered. Luna's tail gave a tentative wag, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer had the power to paralyze him. Whatever waited in Millfield, reconciliation or rejection, healing or heartbreak, he was finally strong enough to face it. The rain continued falling, but Marcus was done waiting for clearer skies. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Jake watched Shadow nose around her food bowl, still favoring her left side, but moving with considerably more confidence than she had just weeks ago. The sight of her eating with genuine appetite never failed to stir something deep in his chest, a mixture of pride and protective tenderness he hadn't felt in years. His phone buzzed against the counter. Marcus again, the third call this week. Jake had been avoiding his brother's attempts to reach out, but the persistence was wearing him down. With a reluctant sigh, he answered. "About damn time." Marcus's voice carried relief and frustration in equal measure. "I was starting to think you'd changed your number." "Been busy." Jake's response was deliberately short, his eyes still on Shadow. "Look, I know you don't want to hear this, but Mum's been asking about you. She wants to see you, Jake. It's been 3 years since Lily's funeral. I know how long it's been." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken words and carefully avoided conversations. Marcus finally broke it with a gentler tone. "She's not getting any younger, brother, and neither are we. Maybe it's time to..." "Time to what? Pretend everything's fine? Act like I didn't fail the one person who mattered most?" Shadow lifted her head at the sharp edge in his voice, her amber eyes fixed on him with that uncanny ability she had to read his emotional state. Jake forced his shoulders to relax, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't fail anyone," Marcus said quietly. "Lily's cancer wasn't your fault. The accident wasn't your fault. When are you going to stop punishing yourself?" Jake closed his eyes, the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders like an old coat. "I can't do this conversation right now." "Then when? When can we do this conversation? Because I'm tired of watching you disappear, Jake. We all are." The line went dead as Jake ended the call, his hand trembling slightly as he set the phone down. Shadow approached cautiously, pressing her warm body against his leg in a gesture that had become their silent language of comfort. He reached down to stroke her head, finding solace in her steady presence. A knock at the garage door interrupted the moment. Jake wasn't expecting anyone, and very few people knew where to find him. He opened the door to find Sarah standing there, a covered dish in her hands and determination written across her face. "Don't even think about turning me away," she said before he could speak. "I brought lunch, and we're going to eat it together like civilized human beings." Despite himself, Jake felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "That so?" "That's so." She pushed past him into the garage, Shadow trotting over to greet her with what could almost be called enthusiasm. "Besides, I think our girl here has been looking forward to seeing me." Sarah had taken to calling Shadow our girl, a casual possessiveness that both warmed Jake and terrified him. The way she'd seamlessly inserted herself into their routine, the easy domesticity of shared meals and comfortable silences, it all felt dangerously close to something he'd convinced himself he could never have again. "You're different today," she observed, studying his face with those perceptive green eyes. "Everything okay?" Jake hesitated, unused to having someone notice the subtle shifts in his mood, unused to being asked. My brother called. Family stuff. Sarah waited, clearly hoping he'd elaborate, but not pushing when he didn't. It was one of the things he appreciated about her. She offered space for his words without demanding them. Families are complicated, she said finally. Trust me, I know something about that. There was a story there, Jake realized. Sarah rarely mentioned her own family, and he'd been too wrapped up in his own carefully guarded past to ask. The recognition that they both carried unspoken histories created an unexpected moment of connection. Maybe, he found himself saying, maybe you could tell me about yours sometime. Something shifted in Sarah's expression, surprise, then a soft vulnerability that made his chest tighten. I'd like that. And maybe you could tell me about yours. The possibility hung between them. Fragile and loaded with implications, neither was quite ready to voice. Shadows stirred at their feet, stretching and yawning, oblivious to the careful dance of trust playing out above her. Yeah, Jake said quietly, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the small table. Maybe I could. For the first time in 3 years, the word maybe didn't feel like a lie. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Jake watched Riley methodically demolish her breakfast, her tail wagging with each bite. 3 months had passed since that first night in the garage, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Her ribs no longer showed through patchy fur, her coat now gleamed with health, and most importantly, the constant fear had faded from her amber eyes. Good girl, he murmured, running his hand along her back. She leaned into his touch without hesitation now, a simple gesture that still amazed him. Trust had come slowly for both of them, built one gentle moment at a time. His phone buzzed against the counter. Sarah's name lit up the screen, and Jake felt that familiar tightness in his chest. 3 weeks since their last real conversation, since she'd told him she was seeing someone new. He'd been expecting it, even encouraging it in his own way, but hearing it had hit harder than anticipated. Hey, he answered, keeping his voice neutral. Jake, I need to ask you something. Her tone was different today, less of the careful politeness they'd maintained recently. Are you dating someone? The question caught him off guard. What? No. Why would you think that? Because Jenny Morrison saw you at the hardware store yesterday, and she said you were buying dog toys and talking to some woman about training techniques. You looked happy, Jake. Really happy. She said it was the first time she'd seen you smile like that since the divorce. The words hung unspoken between them. Jake glanced down at Riley, who had finished eating and was now sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those expressive eyes that seemed to understand everything. It's not what you think, Sarah. I'm not dating anyone. Then what? Because something's changed. I can hear it in your voice. He walked to the window, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across his small backyard. How could he explain that a broken dog had somehow started putting the pieces of his broken heart back together? That learning to trust again, even in this unconventional way, had begun to heal wounds he'd thought were permanent? I rescued a dog, he said finally. She was in bad shape, abused. I've been helping her recover. Silence stretched between them. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer. That's very like you. Remember when you brought home that injured bird when we were married? You stayed up all night making sure it was okay. He did remember. Sarah had teased him about his soft heart hidden beneath the leather jacket and tough exterior. It felt strange to have her acknowledge that part of him now, after everything. Jake, she continued, I called because Tom proposed last night. The words should have hurt more than they did. Instead, Jake felt something unexpected, a genuine sense of peace. Congratulations, he's a good guy. You mean that? Yeah, I do. And he realized he actually did. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for months seemed to have lifted without him noticing. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. We both do. Jake looked down at Riley again. She'd moved to lie across his feet, a habit she'd developed that never failed to make him smile. This 60-pound dog somehow believed she was small enough to be a lapdog, and he didn't have the heart to correct her. "I'm getting there," he said honestly. "It's been a process." "The dog's helping?" "More than I expected. Her name's Riley. She's teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn." "Like what?" Jake considered the question. How to explain that watching Riley learn to trust again had shown him his own capacity for healing, that her courage in the face of past trauma had inspired him to stop hiding from his own pain. Like how to start over without forgetting what came before, how to be patient with the healing process, how to trust that good things can still happen even after everything's fallen apart. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I'm glad, Jake. I really am. I hated thinking of you alone and hurting." After they hung up, Jake sat on his back steps with Riley beside him. She rested her head on his knee, a gesture of comfort that had become second nature. The conversation with Sarah had stirred up memories, but they didn't carry the sharp edge of pain they once had. "What do you think, girl? Ready for that training class this afternoon?" Riley's ears perked up at the word class. They'd been working with a local trainer, and while Riley was excelling, Jake had to admit he looked forward to these sessions, for reasons beyond his dog's progress. The trainer, Emma, had a gentle way with damaged animals that reminded him there were still good people in the world. Riley barked once, her tail wagging, and Jake laughed. "All right then, let's go show them what we've learned." The morning sun cast long shadows across the veterinary clinic's parking lot as Jake carried the small carrier toward the entrance. Inside, Lady shifted nervously, her breathing rapid and shallow. Dr. Martinez had called at dawn, the results were in, and they needed to discuss treatment options immediately. Sarah's hand found his free one, squeezing gently. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." Jake nodded, though his throat felt tight. Over the past 3 months, Lady had become more than just a rescued dog. She'd become his anchor, his reason to come home each night, his reminder that broken things could heal with enough patience and love. Dr. Martinez met them in the examination room, her expression carefully neutral. She lifted Lady onto the metal table with practiced gentleness, running her hands over the dog's trembling frame. "The X-rays show significant damage to her left hip joint," she began, pulling up the images on her computer screen. "See here? The socket is malformed, likely from an old fracture that never healed properly. It's causing constant pain and will only worsen with time." Jake studied the ghostly white bones on the monitor, his jaw clenching. "What are our options?" "Surgery. Hip replacement. It's expensive and there are risks, especially given her history of trauma. But without it," Dr. Martinez's voice trailed off meaningfully, "without it, she'll suffer." Sarah finished quietly. "How expensive?" Jake asked, though he'd already made his decision. Price didn't matter. Lady had saved him in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. 15,000, maybe more if complications arise. Jake didn't flinch. He'd been setting aside money from the garage, living lean, preparing for something like this. "When can we schedule it?" Dr. Martinez looked surprised. "You don't need time to think about it?" Jake's hand rested on Lady's head, feeling her lean into his touch despite her pain. "She didn't hesitate to trust me. I won't hesitate to help her." 2 days later, Jake paced the clinic's waiting room like a caged animal. The surgery had been going for 4 hours. Sarah sat nearby, occasionally trying to convince him to eat something from the vending machine, but food was the last thing on his mind. Marcus had stopped by earlier, bringing coffee and awkward comfort. "She's tougher than she looks, brother. Just like someone else I know." But Jake couldn't shake the memory of Lady's trusting eyes as the anesthesia took hold. What if something went wrong? What if he'd pushed her toward something she couldn't handle? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. "Mr. Morrison?" Dr. Martinez appeared in scrubs, her mask pulled down. Jake's heart stopped until he saw her smile. She did beautifully. The surgery was successful. Relief flooded through him so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. Sarah's arm slipped around his waist, steadying him. "Can I see her?" "She's still sedated, but yes, just for a few minutes." Lady lay on a padded table in the recovery room, her left leg wrapped and immobilized. She looked impossibly small under the warming blankets, but her breathing was steady and strong. Jake approached slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. "Hey, girl," he whispered, his fingers barely grazing her fur. "You did good. Real good." Her eyes fluttered open at his voice, unfocused but seeking. When she found his face, her tail managed the faintest wag. The next weeks blurred together in a routine of medication schedules, physical therapy, and gradual recovery. Jake converted his living room into a recovery space, sleeping on the couch so he could monitor Lady's needs through the night. Sarah practically moved in, helping with the constant care, never complaining about the disruption to their still-new relationship. "You know," she said one evening, as they watched Lady take her first tentative steps without the supporting sling, "I think I understand now why you two found each other." "Yeah? Why's that?" "You both know what it's like to have everything broken and still keep fighting. Most people would have given up, but not you two." Jake watched Lady navigate the short distance between her bed and water bowl, her movements careful but determined. 3 months ago she could barely lift her head. Now she was walking, healing, learning to trust that each step wouldn't bring pain. "Maybe that's what healing really is," he said quietly. "Not forgetting what broke you, but choosing to keep moving anyway." Lady completed her journey and looked back at them, her tail wagging with genuine joy. The transformation was remarkable, from the terrified, broken creature who'd collapsed in his garage to this resilient survivor taking charge of her own recovery. As if sensing his thoughts, Lady limped over to where he sat and rested her chin on his knee. The simple gesture carried the weight of everything they'd endured together, everything they'd overcome, and everything they'd learned about the power of refusing to give up on each other. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but inside, surrounded by love and healing, they were ready for whatever came next. The knock on Jake's door came at dawn, sharp and insistent. He rolled out of bed, Luna immediately alert beside him, her ears pricked forward. Through the peephole, he saw 2 uniforms and felt his stomach drop. "Mr. Morrison, we need to speak with you about Marcus Henley." Jake opened the door slowly, Luna pressing against his leg. The older officer, weathered and tired-looking, held up his badge. "I'm Detective Rodriguez. This is Officer Kim. Mind if we come in?" "What's this about?" Jake asked, though he already knew. "Marcus Henley was found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide." Rodriguez studied Jake's face carefully. "We're talking to everyone who had recent contact with him." Jake stepped aside to let them in, his hand finding Luna's head for comfort. She leaned into his touch, sensing his tension. "I testified at his hearing yesterday, that's all. According to the guards, Henley was pretty agitated after your testimony. Kept talking about how everything was ruined, how he'd lost everything that mattered." Officer Kim pulled out a notebook. "What exactly did you say to him?" "Nothing directly. I just told the truth about what he did to Luna." Jake's voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened in Luna's fur. She pressed closer, offering silent support. Rodriguez crouched down, extending his hand toward Luna. She sniffed cautiously, then allowed him to scratch behind her ears. "This is her? The dog from the case?" "Yeah, that's Luna. She looks good, healthy." The detective's voice softened as Luna's tail gave a tentative wag. A lot different from the photos in the case file. Jake nodded, watching Luna interact with the stranger. 6 months ago, she would have cowered behind him. Now she was cautiously accepting pets from a man she'd never met. The progress still amazed him. "Look, Mr. Morrison," Rodriguez continued, standing up. "Henley left some things in his cell. Letters he'd written but never sent. Most were to family, but one was addressed to you." Jake's blood chilled. "To me." Officer Kim pulled out an evidence bag containing a folded piece of paper. "We've already processed it for evidence. Nothing threatening or incriminating. But we thought you might want to know what it said." Jake took the bag with reluctant hands. Through the plastic he could see cramped handwriting. His name was scrawled across the top in angry letters. "Do I have to read this now?" "No," Rodriguez said gently. "Take your time." "But Jake, Whatever's in there, remember that his choices were his own. What happened to him, what he did to himself, that's not on you. After the officers left, Jake sat on his couch staring at the letter. Luna curled up beside him, her head resting on his thigh. Her warm weight grounded him, reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. The phone rang. Sarah's voice was gentle when he answered. "I heard about Marcus. The prosecutor called me. Are you okay? The cops just left. He wrote me a letter before he—" Jake's voice trailed off. "Have you read it?" "Not yet. I'm not sure I want to." "You don't have to. You could throw it away right now and never think about it again." Jake looked down at Luna, who was watching him with those expressive brown eyes that had learned to trust again. "She's not afraid anymore, Sarah. Luna, she's really not afraid." "No, she's not. She's learned that not everyone will hurt her. Maybe I need to read it, to really close this chapter. Whatever you decide, I'm here. We all are. Me, Tommy, the whole crew. You're not facing this alone." After hanging up, Jake carefully opened the evidence bag and unfolded the letter. Marcus's handwriting was erratic, filled with rage and self-pity. He blamed Jake for destroying his life, claimed he'd only been trying to train the dog properly, insisted that everyone had turned against him unfairly. But as Jake read on, the tone shifted. Marcus wrote about his childhood, about his father who'd beaten him, about feeling powerless and taking it out on something smaller and weaker. He wrote about seeing Jake and Luna in court, seeing the bond between them, and realizing what he'd destroyed. The letter ended abruptly. "You gave her what I never could. Maybe that's justice." Jake set the letter aside and pulled Luna closer. She snuggled against him, completely relaxed and trusting. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the shop coming to life, Tommy's voice, the rumble of motorcycles, the familiar rhythms of his world. "It's over, girl," he whispered into Luna's soft fur. "He can't hurt you anymore. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Luna looked up at him and licked his face, her tail wagging slowly. In her eyes, Jake saw no trace of the terror that had haunted her when she'd first stumbled into his garage. She'd found her way back to trust, to love, to hope. And somehow, in saving her, she'd saved him too. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Jake's face as he paced the waiting room for the third time in 10 minutes. His boots squeaked against the polished floor, each step echoing his mounting anxiety. Sage had been in surgery for over 2 hours now, and the silence from the medical team was deafening. Maya sat in the corner chair, her legs tucked beneath her, watching him with concerned eyes. She'd driven straight to the clinic when he'd called, her voice steady over the phone even as his had cracked with panic. Now she remained quiet, understanding that words wouldn't ease the knot of fear twisted tight in his chest. The doors to the surgical suite swung open, and Dr. Richardson emerged, still wearing her scrubs. Jake stopped mid-stride, his heart hammering against his ribs as he searched her face for answers. "She's stable," Dr. Richardson said immediately, and Jake's knees nearly buckled with relief. "The surgery went well. We managed to remove the damaged tissue and repair the internal bleeding." "She's a fighter, Jake. That dog has an incredible will to live. Can I see her?" His voice came out rougher than intended, the weight of the past few hours evident in every syllable. "She's still under anesthesia, but yes, just for a few minutes." Jake followed the veterinarian down a short hallway to the recovery room. Sage lay motionless on the padded table, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm beneath the white bandages. An IV line snaked from her front leg to a bag of fluids hanging nearby. She looked so small, so vulnerable, that Jake felt his throat constrict. "The next 24 hours are critical," Dr. Richardson explained softly, "but her vitals are strong. She'll need weeks of recovery, and there might be some lasting effects from the trauma, but I believe she'll pull through this." Jake reached out tentatively, his calloused fingers barely grazing the soft fur on Sage's head. "Hey there, girl," he whispered. "You keep fighting, okay? I'm not going anywhere." Back in the waiting room, Maya stood as he approached. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him, and Jake found himself melting into her embrace. The fear, the helplessness, the crushing weight of almost losing Sage. It all came pouring out in a shuddering breath against Maya's shoulder. "I can't lose her," he said, his voice muffled. "She saved me, Maya. When I found her, I thought I was rescuing her, but she was the one doing the rescuing." Maya pulled back slightly, her hands framing his face. "You're not going to lose her. And Jake, you saved each other. That's what love does. It goes both ways." They spent the night at the clinic, taking turns dozing in the uncomfortable chairs while keeping vigil. When morning came, Dr. Richardson allowed them into the recovery room again. This time, Sage's eyes were open, though clouded with medication. Her tail managed the faintest wag when she saw Jake. "There she is," Jake said, settling into the chair beside her. "My brave girl." Maya stood at the foot of the table, watching the interaction with a soft smile. Over the past months, she'd witnessed Jake's transformation from a man locked behind walls of grief and anger to someone capable of profound tenderness. Sage had unlocked something in him that Maya wasn't sure anyone else could have reached. "I've been thinking," Maya said quietly, "about what happens next." Jake looked up from stroking Sage's ear. "What do you mean?" "The recovery, the physical therapy she'll need, the medication schedule, it's going to be intensive. You can't do it alone while running the garage." "I'll figure it out," Jake said immediately, his jaw setting with determination. "Whatever she needs." "I know you will, but I want to help. I mean really help, not just check in occasionally." Maya took a breath, the words she'd been considering all night finally finding their voice. "I want to be there for both of you, if you'll let me." Jake studied her face, seeing the sincerity there, the genuine care for both him and Sage. Something shifted in his chest, a wall finally crumbling completely. "Maya, you don't know what you're signing up for. This recovery could take months. Sage might never be exactly the same." "Neither were you when I met you," Maya replied gently. "Broken things can heal, Jake. Sometimes they heal stronger than before." Sage's eyes had drifted closed again, but her breathing remained steady. Jake reached across the space between them and took Maya's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I'd like that a lot." Outside the clinic windows, the morning sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the recovery room. It felt like a promise, Jake thought, a promise of healing, of second chances, of the possibility that broken hearts and battered souls could find their way back to wholeness. Sage stirred slightly, and Jake squeezed Maya's hand tighter, ready to face whatever came next. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Maya's feet as she emerged into the harsh afternoon sunlight, Jake's protective hand resting on the small of her back. The trial was over. Marcus would spend the next 15 years behind bars, and the restraining orders against his associates were permanent. After months of legal battles, testimony, and reliving the darkest chapters of her past, it was finally finished. "You did it," Jake murmured, his voice thick with pride and relief. "It's over, Maya, really over." She nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly as she clutched the folder containing all the legal documents. Freedom felt strange, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit yet. For so long, fear had been her constant companion that its absence left an odd emptiness. Bella waited in Jake's truck, her golden coat gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the window. The dog's transformation over the past year had been nothing short of miraculous. Where once there had been cowering and flinching, now there was confidence and joy. Her tail wagged furiously as she spotted them approaching, and Maya couldn't help but smile at the sight. "Look at her," Maya said, her voice softening. "Remember when she wouldn't even let us touch her?" Jake opened the truck door, and Bella immediately bounded out, circling them both with enthusiastic energy. Her limp was barely noticeable now, just a slight hitch in her gait that the veterinarian said would probably always be there but wouldn't slow her down. "She knew what she was doing that night," Jake said, scratching behind Bella's ears. "Found exactly the right garage, didn't you, girl?" "I've been thinking," Jake said as they pulled into the driveway. About what you said before, about opening that sanctuary. Maya turned to look at him, surprised. She'd mentioned the idea weeks ago, a place for abused animals to heal, maybe even a program that paired them with people who needed healing too. But Jake had been non-committal, and she hadn't pushed. "The Morrison property is going up for sale," he continued, killing the engine. 20 acres already has some outbuildings. It would need work, but... He shrugged, but she could see the excitement he was trying to hide. "Might be exactly what we need." Inside the garage, Maya sank onto their old couch, the same one where Bella had first allowed her to sleep close by, where Jake had first held her after a nightmare, where they'd shared countless quiet mornings over coffee. Bella immediately claimed her spot between them, her head resting on Maya's lap. "Are you sure?" Maya asked, running her fingers through Bella's soft fur. It would be a huge undertaking, and expensive. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. The insurance settlement from the accident came through, all of it, more than enough to get started. He paused, his voice growing quiet. Sarah would have liked the idea, helping things that are broken find their way back to whole. Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. In all their time together, Jake rarely spoke about his late wife directly, but when he did, it was always with this kind of gentle reverence that made Maya love him even more. "We could help so many," she whispered, the possibilities spinning through her mind. "Not just animals, people too, like a real healing place, like this garage was for us," Jake agreed, pulling her closer. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Bella lifted her head and looked between them, her tail thumping against the couch cushions. This dog who had brought them together, who had taught them both that trust could be rebuilt and love could exist without fear. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting everything in golden light. Maya closed her eyes and let herself imagine it. Acres of green space, rescued animals finding their confidence again, broken people discovering they weren't beyond repair. A place where healing happened naturally, organically, the way it had here in this unlikely sanctuary. "Yes," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Jake's gaze. "Let's do it. Let's build something beautiful." Jake's smile was answer enough, and as Bella settled back into her favorite spot between them, Maya realized that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys began with the smallest acts of courage, like a broken dog choosing to trust again. The courthouse steps felt like climbing a mountain, each one heavier than the last. Jake's hand found mine, steady and warm, while his other arm cradled Luna against his chest. She'd insisted on coming, this dog who had started it all, who had somehow known that two broken souls needed each other to become whole again. "You sure about this?" Jake's voice carried that familiar gravel, but underneath lay something I'd never heard before, hope mixed with terror. I squeezed his fingers, never been more sure of anything. The courthouse buzzed with Monday morning energy, lawyers in sharp suits rushing past, families clutching papers, everyone focused on their own small dramas. We found the right office after wandering through marble hallways that echoed our footsteps like whispered promises. The words hung in the air between us, domestic partnership. It wasn't marriage, we weren't ready for that mountain yet, but it was a declaration, a legal recognition that we were choosing each other, choosing this makeshift family we'd built from scraps and determination. "That's us," Jake said, and I caught the slight tremor in his voice. Luna shifted in his arms, her tail wagging softly as she took in the new environment. 6 months ago she would have cowered at the fluorescent lights and echoing voices. Now she watched everything with curious eyes, secure in the knowledge that her pack would protect her. We filled out forms in plastic chairs, sharing a pen and stealing glances at each other like teenagers. Jake's handwriting was surprisingly neat, each letter carefully formed. When he reached the section about emergency contacts, I watched him write my name without hesitation. "Next of kin," I murmured, testing the words. "You okay with that?" His blue eyes searched mine. "Being stuck with me officially?" I thought about everything that had brought us here. The night Luna stumbled into his garage, bleeding and broken. The weeks of careful healing, both hers and ours. The slow dance of learning to trust, to let someone else carry part of the weight. The way Jake's smile had gradually returned. How my own walls had crumbled brick by careful brick. "I was stuck with you the moment you chose to save her," I said. "This just makes it legal." The ceremony itself was brief and practical, nothing like the wedding fantasies I'd harbored as a girl. But when Jake took my hand and promised to be my partner in whatever came next, his voice steady and sure, it felt more real than any fairy tale. I promised the same, my words carrying the weight of every morning we'd shared, every crisis we'd weathered, every quiet moment that had stitched us together. Luna barked once when the clerk pronounced us domestic partners, as if adding her own seal of approval. Afterward, we walked to the small park across the street, Luna trotting between us on her leash. The spring air carried the scent of cherry blossoms, and somewhere a street musician played guitar, the melody weaving through the urban soundtrack of car horns and distant conversations. "So what now?" Jake asked, settling beside me on a bench while Luna investigated the grass with scientific precision. "Now we go home," I said, and the word felt different somehow, weighted with new meaning. Home wasn't just the small house we'd been sharing for 3 months, with its mismatched furniture and Luna's toys scattered across the living room floor. It was the choice we'd made, the family we'd claimed. "Think she knows?" Jake nodded toward Luna, who had found a particularly interesting stick and was carrying it proudly. "She's always known. She picked us before we picked each other." Jake laughed, that rough sound I'd learned to treasure. "Smart dog, the smartest." I leaned against his shoulder, solid and familiar. "She saw something we couldn't see yet." "What's that?" "That broken doesn't mean worthless. That healing is possible. That sometimes the most unlikely combinations make the strongest bonds." Luna abandoned her stick and returned to us, settling across both our feet like a living link. Jake's hand found mine again, our simple silver bands catching the afternoon light. They weren't engagement rings or wedding bands, but something uniquely ours, a promise to keep choosing each other day after day through whatever storms might come. "I love you," he said quietly, the words still new enough to carry wonder. "I love you too," I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this moment. None of us could have predicted how salvation might arrive on 4 legs, bleeding and desperate, carrying the exact medicine 3 broken hearts needed to heal. But here we were, officially family, bound by choice and sealed with hope. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer lonely. The courthouse steps gleamed white in the morning sun, as Marcus adjusted his tie one final time. He'd worn his cleanest jeans and the button-down shirt Sarah had picked out for him, but standing here among the lawyers and officials, he felt like he was playing dress-up. Beside him, Sarah squeezed his hand, her simple sundress catching the breeze. "You ready for this?" she whispered, her eyes sparkling with the same nervous excitement he felt churning in his stomach. Marcus looked down at Luna, who sat perfectly at his feet, wearing a new collar with tiny silver bells that chimed softly when she moved. The scars along her back had faded to thin white lines, barely visible beneath her glossy coat. Her dark eyes held none of the terror that had haunted them that first night in his garage. Instead, she watched the world with curious confidence, tail wagging gently as people passed by. "Yeah," he said, meaning it. "I'm ready." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and gradual healing. Jeremy Caldwell had received a 5-year sentence for animal cruelty and assault, though Marcus suspected the man would serve less. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Luna was safe, that Sarah was here, and that somehow, against all odds, he'd found his way back to believing in second chances. Judge Martinez, the same woman who'd presided over Luna's custody hearing, emerged from the courthouse with a small crowd of family and friends. Marcus's crew had shown up in force. Big Jim, Tommy, even gruff old Pete wore his least offensive t-shirt for the occasion. Sarah's parents had driven down from Portland, her mother clutching tissues and her father trying to hide his grin behind his beard. "Well," Judge Martinez said, her stern courtroom demeanor replaced by genuine warmth, "I've performed many ceremonies in my career, but this might be my favorite venue yet." Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. When Sarah had suggested getting married on the courthouse steps, he'd thought she was joking, but she'd been serious. She wanted their wedding to be here, where their story had really begun, where a judge had looked past his rough exterior and trusted him with Luna's life. "This was Sarah's idea," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion as he knelt beside Luna. Attached to her collar was a small velvet pouch containing their wedding bands. She said Luna brought us together, so she should be part of making it official. Luna's tail wagged furiously as Sarah scratched behind her ears, carefully retrieving the rings. The simple gold bands caught the sunlight, and Marcus thought about the journey that had led them here, from that first terrifying night when Luna had chosen his garage as sanctuary, through the court battles and the slow, careful process of learning to trust again. "Marcus," Judge Martinez said, "do you take Sarah to be your wife, to love and cherish in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live?" He looked into Sarah's eyes, seeing his own wonder reflected there. 6 months ago, he'd been a man convinced he was better off alone, nursing old wounds and keeping the world at arm's length. Now he couldn't imagine facing a single day without her laugh, her stubborn optimism, her way of seeing the best in everyone, even broken-down bikers with more scars than sense. "I do," he said, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that barely trembled. Sarah's vows came through tears and laughter, her voice strong despite the emotion. When she promised to love him through whatever storms might come, Luna barked once, as if adding her own approval to the proceedings. The kiss was soft and sweet, tasting of new beginnings and promises kept. Big Jim whooped loudly enough to startle a flock of pigeons from the courthouse roof, and even Pete was suspiciously misty-eyed. As the small crowd erupted in cheers and congratulations, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, the last piece of the wall he'd built around his heart finally crumbling away. He pulled Sarah close. Luna pressed against their legs, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. "So, Mrs. Chen," he murmured against Sarah's ear, loving the way she shivered at the name. "What happens now?" She pulled back to look at him, her smile brighter than the courthouse steps, brighter than the future stretching endlessly ahead of them. "Now," she said, scratching Luna's head as their dog, their family, looked up at them with adoring eyes, "we go home and start the rest of our lives." And as they walked down those white stone steps together, Marcus knew that sometimes the best journeys began with the smallest acts of courage, like opening a garage door for a frightened dog or opening your heart when you'd sworn never to risk it again.